and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and of course we want to talk about this full moon that's coming up tomorrow, which is also an eclipse, the first of three in this eclipse season that we're having. And I believe that the biggest one is going to be the solstice eclipse, which is the new moon coming up this month, which is on the 20th of June, right as the solstice happens. As Sun enters Cancer at the 0-degree point, it turns into an eclipse with the moon there too, and the nodes there. So that's going to be dramatic, but we don't want to talk about that today. However, what I would like to talk about today, as we talk about this full moon, is the preceding new moon, because we are in the midst of that 30-day lunation cycle that started on May 22nd with the Gemini new moon, which was at 2 degrees of Gemini. And very interestingly, 2 degrees of Gemini also made a perfect trine with Saturn in the sky. Let me show you that chart. So here we have, this is the actual new moon chart from a couple of weeks ago. And we know that the full moon is tomorrow, but on Friday also, on the 5th of June. But just for a second, we're going to take a look at this chart for the beginning of this cycle, which was the new moon that started. And here you can see the sun and moon at 2 degrees of Gemini. You can see that almost 2 degrees, Saturn was in Aquarius. So this is a very Saturnian time, and what I am getting at, we are seeing with these protests and with the clampdown and with the offer to use military on the part of the president, the executive office. It's a strange time, but authoritarian times are indicated that by the Saturn, by the Pluto. You know that we have a very strong Pluto. We've been talking about that as well in past talks. Just to mention, Pluto is at 24 degrees of Capricorn, whereas Eris is at 24 degrees of Aries. And opposite that is this new planet Haumea, which is very close to the 24-degree mark. It's only a couple of degrees away. So we have a pretty powerful T-square between three very slow-moving planets. And these planets conspire to focalize on the Pluto and make Pluto even stronger at this time. Not only that, but we do have also other aspects that come in from also Venus and Mercury, which were right together. But retrograde Venus and Mercury moving forward for the moment, it will station to retrograde motion later on in June. But these two at the 20-degree mark were also exactly square to Neptune at 20 degrees of Pisces, with actually also the Sun and Moon in quintile. So we just want to refer to these things. We just want to kind of get our reference points for this current lunation cycle that we're in the midst of. And you know, Uranus is also a factor in this. We won't get into the details of that, but it does make aspects to both Neptune and to Chiron. So without further ado, let's take a look at the current chart, because that's what we're actually trying to talk about here. And so here's the current full moon lunar eclipse chart, and it is at the 15-degree mark of Sag. And you can see also, with the sun and moon opposite each other at 15 degrees of Sag, and the moon is at 15 degrees of Sag, and the sun is at 15 degrees of Gemini. We have also Mars at 15 degrees of Pisces, very close to this Neptune. Now, the reason I brought up all those preliminaries was to remember that we're in the midst of a cycle that has very strong Neptune, very strong Pluto, and also Saturn was indicated. And now what we see is that in fact, you know, the fact that Mars is so close to Neptune, it's 5 degrees away, or not quite, yeah, it's exactly 5 degrees away. Normally we wouldn't talk about this so much. That's kind of a large orb for transiting planets. But the fact that we're in the middle of a Neptune cycle already, that Mars is closing in on Neptune, and that this is such a perfect T-square and an eclipse, for that matter, to Mars. So we have a strong Mars. Now Mars, of course, rules, in fact, military force. You know, so we have a kind of a combination of ingredients where we have not only the Neptune, which does refer back to who do we trust, who do we believe, what is the fact of the matter. It also refers to escapism and to a spiritual component. A spiritual component that I might mention is also echoed by the position of Haumea, which is a spiritual reliance on nature as spiritual path, nature as profound connection to some kind of universal reality We could call it the universe, and we could call it nature, and we could call it God, or we can call it goddess. And it really is almost the same. So what we have is a very strong configuration here with a lot of Pluto. And in this regard, I'd like to mention a quote of Rudyard. And this is going to refer back to what we've been seeing for the last 10 days since the 25th of May, which is the day that that blatant murder took place with police and a captive suspect that they had that was resisting arrest or resisting going into the police car, something like that. Not too very awful compared to the idea of just snuffing out his life, which was done so deliberately and so menacingly, so casually with a hand in the pocket. You know, this actually goes beyond all of the other police violence against people of color. Obviously, almost always people of color. You can't even imagine substituting a white man for that in that situation, a white suspect. It just doesn't go. It wouldn't happen. So that's why black people all over the country are enraged, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the protests that have been nonstop ever since that time. It's 10 days now. So this is quite interesting in light of the fact that there was a kind of a powder keg happening anyway with the repression of the Trump administration being pretty strong as far as the racism and the way black people are treated in this country, as they have been, you know, for a long time. It's just endemic racism. And what we're seeing is the protests, not only to this particular callous act of a Minneapolis policeman, but also to the whole general situation of the disadvantage of people of color and minorities in this country. Now, I've got a quote from Dane Rudyard here that I'd like to read to you, referring to Pluto, which I say is also very much part of this whole story, being very prominent in this current lumination cycle. And what Dane Rudyard has to say is, strong alignments of Pluto often tend to bring out into the open the shadow of political power or personal ambition. They force any entrenched group to surrender its privilege or else face revolution and or moral and spiritual bankruptcy. And I thought that was so prescient for the situation that we have, because, you know, there's the kind of the backlash that we're seeing from the events, you know, where there was a peaceful protest in Washington, D.C. outside the White House, and those troops were mobilized to push the protesters away, to use tear gas on them, even though they were peacefully and lawfully assembled. So, I mean, you know, we're just seeing kind of a crisis come to a head. And we can take a quick look at the U.S. chart. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But as far as talking about the current events, talking about mundane astrology, here we have, actually, let me change that view. Here we have the transits, and they are the transits for this eclipse coming up tomorrow. And what you might notice in this is that the position of the moon, the position of the sun, 15 degrees of mutable signs, makes a trine and a sextile to the Saturn in the U.S. chart at 14 degrees Libra, 48 minutes. So we could say that this is kind of some kind of fulfillment of the initial impulse from that 2-degree Gemini new moon. We showed you the chart. 2 degrees Gemini new moon actually makes an angle, a semi-sextile angle, to the ruler of the 10th house. The fact that in the U.S. chart we have Saturn in the 10th house is indicative of how strong the actual executive branch is in this country. Even stronger right now, of course, just rejecting all the Congress's attempts to put in a little bit of oversight. And so we do see that this is a theme in this particular lunation cycle, the power of the executive, and that is being tested, that is being brought to some kind of semi-resolution. I mean, we did see also, on the same theme, we did see also that the executive branch in the actual state of Minnesota was brought to bear. The attorney general of that state was reassigned or was assigned in a temporary fashion to this particular prosecution of this policeman, and they were trying to review the situation to see if that charge of third-degree murder was adequate, and the charge of second-degree murder was arrived at based on a review of the evidence. In other words, it was a stronger intentionality in that killing, or in that murder, we could call it, than was previously acknowledged by the third-degree charge. And there were also conflicting autopsies. There's also the issue that the other 3 officers were now charged. So what we have is a rather remarkable thing. We have a protest across the country that has been ongoing, sustained, and we have response in terms of the executive branch within the state of Minnesota in a favorable way to say, look, let's listen to these people. They have a legitimate grievance here. They're protesting the unlawful treatment of a black citizen based on a racist attitude by policemen, which is endemic in this country. So it's very interesting to see that we have the difficulty, but also the attempt at a solution, the compassionate reaching out between the protesters and the authorities in the case of this assignment of a man from the Attorney General of the state, from the upper echelon of the state executive branch. And then we have also, contrastingly, the other executive people in the Washington, D.C. situation, where they have also a little bit of a conflict because there's Trump on the one hand, and then even his Secretary of Defense says you can't really bring the military into this, it's lawful demonstrations, with a few disruptions. There are looting and so on, but they seem to be more disruptions than the actual tenor of the situation, which is mostly peaceful. And there was that wonderful image, I don't know how many people saw it, of, in one particular case, I think it was in Ferguson, possibly in Missouri, I'm not sure where it was, but there were police officers confronting protesters who had gone beyond the curfew, and they were protesting after the curfew, and they were protesting peacefully. And the police, the leadership of the police force that was there acknowledged that yes, they were protesting peacefully, and there was a shaking of hands between the leadership of the police and the leadership of the protesters. They all shook hands. And I thought that was such a beautiful moment, that we can have unity over division. Well, now, to get back to the actual, one thing I want to mention also, by the way, I do have the transits for the actual moment of that death in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was on the 25th of May, on Monday, Memorial Day. And if we go to look at those transits, well, that's not it. Huh. I guess I lost him, unfortunately. Let me just put him in again. So we're talking about May, we're talking about the 25th of May. In the time passages software, very easy to see what the current transit is, or a transit for any time in the past. And so here's the transits for that event. Of course, it didn't happen. It happened in Central Time, I think. And I think it's quite interesting that we have the moon in Cancer, the moon on the sun of the U.S. chart. That's quite indicative, is it not? We have Jupiter at 27 degrees of Capricorn, and that is an interesting placement because 27 degrees of Capricorn happens to be the Pluto in the U.S. chart. You can't see it very well, but I can show you over here. Pluto in the natal chart for this inner chart is 27 Capricorn, 33 minutes. So, you know, it's interesting to me that some of these transits do illuminate the Pluto in the U.S. chart, signal that there is something major going on. The moon represents the public when you look at mundane astrology. The moon in the U.S. chart is at 27 degrees also, 27 degrees of Aquarius, so you have that connection as well, a semi-sextile from Jupiter. And Jupiter, of course, right next to Pluto. Part of this whole Pluto empowerment is the fact that Jupiter is coming along and will be actually conjunct with Pluto by the end of this month. So this is tough times, and it's tougher times than we were kind of expecting in this summer time frame. We were hoping that things would calm down. But the COVID is still active. That looks to be a situation. Just to finish with this chart, to me it's also quite interesting that Uranus at 8 degrees of Taurus, matches the Uranus in the U.S. chart 8 degrees of Gemini, and also makes a makes a trine to the Eris in the U.S. chart in the first house. So there's something, Eris is a feminine warrior for soul intention. It has to do with life purpose. In a natal chart, personal chart, would have to do with life purpose. Here in the U.S. chart, it might be considered national purpose. It might be considered, where are we evolving toward as a nation? And to see Uranus hitting that, there's a suddenness about these events that happened at this particular time. This is, well, it doesn't matter if you look at the actual Monday or if you also look at the, see, I can display the most recent transit. Either way, of course, Uranus is going to be right there at 8 degrees of Taurus with this full moon, with this new moon also. It's been right there. And, there is a suddenness to these events. And maybe there is an insight that's being arrived at, which is another key word for Uranus, to these events, which does maybe influence our understanding of where the character of this country is headed. That this is a trying time for sure, but this is also a time, I think, of great optimism. And I'll just, the last part of this mundane section, I'll just mention that there was a commentator, and I thought he made a very good statement. It was a pastor. He was talking about the church being used as a prop on some of the administration's efforts at a photo op around the time of the protest, the beginning of the protest. And, what he said was, because the commentator he was being interviewed, of course, on cable news, right? And the commentator said, we have the COVID and we have this terrible situation that happened in Minneapolis, which just kind of reflects the whole situation with Black Lives Matter and the way the police treat racially dark citizens compared to white citizens. And the thing that they said also, this commentator, the newsman, the interviewer, said, and the hopelessness of the situation. And the pastor raised his hand at that point and said, I must give you a different message there, because these protests, these largely peaceful protests all across the country for day after day after day, are not a sign of hopelessness. They're a sign that we are hopeful. They are a sign that we think we can make a difference, that by enough people being massed in the streets like this, it can actually make a difference. And I thought that was a very good thing to say as well. So, you do have Jupiter. You do have the sense that there may be a way that we can evolve as a nation, thinking about the Eris being very much part, well, also, of course, Chiron, which is the painful situation, is also making that angle, which is a square to natal Eris in the U.S. chart. So both Chiron and Uranus at 8 degrees beaming down on the natal, in the United States chart, the natal Eris, and also the U.S. Uranus as well. I think it's just quite dramatic, some of these aspects, and to think about that there is a sign of hope there, a sign that there could be additional insights that we could gain along with the pain, that we can recognize that a way to go. We can recognize there is a better way a way out of this. So getting back to the chart, that was a lot about the mundane situation. I know we like to talk about the personal situation, and it's really not that different. There is an evolution that's happening for each one of us, depending on where Pluto lies in your chart, depending on how it hits your chart. And we're in the midst of it, and this is going on. When I saw that Pluto was very active in this time frame, I saw that at the middle of May, with May 14th transits, which was a last quarter moon. It's very interesting to see this Pluto coming up at this time, and also the Neptune, of course, which is who do we trust, who do we believe, which is fake news and which is the real deal, who's telling the truth here. It's very, very interesting to see these things coming up at this time, and to think that we thought maybe we were going to get past COVID around this time, that we would shelter in place long enough so that we would bend the curve downward, and that we could just go back to work, and we could be also testing and contact tracing and ensuring that the people that we're working with are probably not positive. They tested negative, hopefully, recently. But I see the other thing. I see the other thing with this strong Pluto. I think the COVID situation is actually going to get worse before it gets better, and I hate to say that, but that Pluto has signaled the evolution of this process, the developments, I should say, of this process with COVID. And the fact that it's prominent now makes me think that we're not out of the woods this summer at all. There's some indications that August might be difficult that way. There's indications that November is going to be extremely difficult in that way, involving Pluto at some of these same degrees, and Uranus being square. And I do think we're in for a rough ride the whole rest of this year. And of course, what will change is when a virus becomes widely available, which probably won't be till the spring. Anyway, that's enough of the mundane situation. I feel like I'm a cable news reporter myself. But what I want to say is that, we are in the midst of this evolutionary time. And that applies to each one of us. And each one of us with strong Eris, with Eris squared Pluto, with strong Pluto, which is transformational in its effects, we are each one of us in some stage of an evolutionary process where we're tuning in to what is going on for us individually and how we may individually help the situation or harm the situation by our actions. And once again, you can see very clearly that in this COVID situation, the individual is supremely important. The actions of each individual count. If the individuals are going out and protest marching in a peaceful way, that counts. If the one or two individuals are creating havoc and destroying property because they want to see a bigger race war going on, that counts too, in a different way, in a negative way. And each one of us, it's up to us how we handle the COVID situation, how we do social distancing. Are we helping or hurting? Are we wearing a face mask to protect others from the potential that we might have the COVID? So it's just a very, very profound time. I remember seeing quite some time ago now, during the Vietnam War, Rennie Davis, I think, if I got that right, making a comment to a crowd of people that were gathered to protest the war. And the comment that that person made at that time, that leader of the anti-war movement, he said to this crowd, he said, "Vietnam is such a jewel." And it really struck me. It was really an odd thing to hear, at that time when we were talking about how terrible the Vietnam War was and how unjustified and how it was killing both people over there and their own soldiers were dying. And he was talking about the awareness. He was talking about the increase in awareness that had come as a result of these trials and the further trials of the 60s, of course, and we absorbed those into our culture. And now we're facing a similar time. We're facing a similar set of trials where we have to decide individually, each one of us, what is the path that we individually want to take? What is the path that we want to see this country take? And how can we be on the right side of history? How can we help? What can we do to help? So I think that's the message of these times that we just have to keep in mind. Let me transition back here. So just to recognize that this is a very, very valuable time. COVID-19 is a jewel. It is a precious time when we really have a chance to think for ourselves, to think about ourselves, to think of what we might be up to, where we could improve, what are our hang-ups, what are our possibilities to get beyond them. And it's personal evolution right there, straight up. And to help you with some of this, perhaps, we do have the Time Passages Standard Edition on sale this month. We do want to make that as widely available as possible for people to check in on their own personal astrology. We think that's a very good way to tune in. It provides an objective mirror for some of the things that are going on within each one of us and within the culture. So that's all for now. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next time.